every painting should have sort of a dominant shape and then a lot of smaller, medium-sized shapes that support that, and then a chorus of smaller shapes. But one of the things that we're going to do is we're going, after we get our sky and our water reflections in lighter values, I want to come back in and create some darks that run through the back of this painting, that is the tree line. And if you look at the photograph, it looks very complex. There's lots of trees, it's very busy. And I think one of the things that we have to learn as painters is how to simplify and just create a big shape if it's not in your center of interest. And we're going to use this background dark of the trees behind this building that's on the wharf to really create a strong value contrast and make this building on the wharf and the wharf itself with the pilings our center of interest. This is where all of our detail will ensue. Everything else gets less important, less detailed, less crisp in edge treatment the farther we move away from our center of interest. I think you can see, if I darken this line a little bit, there's one building. And then with our perspective going back to a vanishing point, you've got your roof line receding backwards, and it gets a little smaller. And if I were to connect the dots along the base of the building, you would see that it all recedes back to a vanishing point. And all vanishing points go back to our horizon line. And in this case, the horizon line is right through the middle of the paper. That's a no-no. But in this case, I've got so much going on below the horizon line and above the horizon line, I didn't feel it was a compromise. So many of you have heard me say that, for an interesting painting, you ought to have a really high horizon line or a really low horizon line. In this case, our tree line kind of brings our eye up anyway. So I'm not too worried about that. As far as the wharf itself, it also follows a perspective. If I lay my pencil down or take a brush, you can see that they also recede back to a vanishing point along my horizon line. And then same on the other side. We have a 2-point perspective where this vanishing point goes over to the right or goes over to the left. And what I would encourage you to do, if you haven't kind of sketched this out, is just loosely kind of put this in, because I tried to give it a little bit of darker line work so you could see kind of where I'm going and can compare that to the photograph. But it doesn't have to be a real rigid line drawing. One of the things that I always like to incorporate in my paintings is I like to get some vertical, oblique, angled shapes. In this case, we had some telephone poles to work with. There's also a mast here on the wharf that's connected in some way to the building. And then you've also got the vertical pilings. So all of that creates a nice rhythm within the painting once we get a little farther into the painting. So those are elements that I've consciously included in my drawing to work with as we begin our painting. All right, so the first step that we're going to do is take a look at my palette over here. I'm going to swing the view over, and you'll see it's kind of at an angle, but I got my water set up. I've got a palette ready to mix things, and I'm just going to take a mop brush that holds a lot of water, and a mop brush is great for skies. But I don't want to have my whole sky wet to begin with. I'm going to work on dry paper, and I'm going to start at the top of the page and work my way down, making horizontal strokes. There might be a few little skips in those and because my board is elevated somewhat so that the top of the page is a little higher. So I'm going to start with some cobalt blue. We'll mix up a nice mixture of good and wet, because I'm not wetting my paper. I'm leaving the paper dry. And I just want to get a really good, juicy mix on my brush and work it into the bristles of the mop brush. So I've got plenty of pigment, because when you put a sky in, typically it's going to dry far lighter, once everything sets up and dries. So coming back to my paper, we've got I'm just going to start. I'm right-handed, so I always start on the left and come across, but it doesn't really matter. Just make these nice marks that come across. You can skip a little bit and make sure you got plenty of water in your brush so that that water runs downhill. You can kind of see it's starting to bead up. And I've got some little skips in there as well. Well, those might be clouds. Who knows what they are? It doesn't really matter. But I will allow some of this water to kind of ooze around some of the dry spots in my painting and keep moving down. I'm going to go back and get a little darker pigment, a little drier pigment, not quite as much water, and start up here at the top and let this get really nice and darker in value. And as it starts coming down, I'll skip around some of these little spots in the white paper. Now I'm going to clean my brush and I'm going to get just a little bit of yellow ochre. And I'm going to put that right into my sky and come right down to the top of my building. And I'm not going to paint over my building. I'm going to leave them as dry, negative shapes. And I'll come right down to the kind of the top of the wharf. I've got some CO2 tanks back here that were behind the building, but I'm just tickling the beaded blue up in the sky and letting the blue kind of run right into this very faint light value, a light mixture of yellow ochre. And if you don't have yellow ochre, you can use raw sienna. It kind of does the same thing. I'm painting right over these buildings that I've got because this will be, they won't be as bright a white as my center of interest. And I'm just kind of popping in a little bit of this warm color right down across the top of the wharf system that's in here. And I'm going to stop there and let you kind of continue to do what I just did. And what this will accomplish while you're painting, I'm just going to keep talking. Some of my blue kind of drops down into this warm area. Some of the warm pigment is up in the sky. When I come in later and put my darks in for the tree line, it's going to make it feel like my sky is connected to the earth by letting the warm yellow ochre kind of bleed into the cooler cobalt blue. I'm going to try to drop just a touch more drier cobalt up here at the top and let it just continue to run downhill, because I think over on the left side, if it's a little bit darker in value than the right side, it creates nice movement across my painting. So I'm just going to let that dry now and let you catch up. And then we're going to do a little surprise here. Actually, you know, when you're bringing your warm down, I've got a little spit of land over here on the right that kind of wraps into the back bay. You can actually take some of your warm and come right down into that, you know, the water line, but if you do, it's all right. We're going to come back and paint over this and add some darker values to that. But for now, just warming that up kind of completes the circuit of what we're doing with the top half of our painting. And this is just an underpainting. It's kind of the first shot at what we're doing. As you go back and forth across your painting with your sky, you're scraping some of that paint off your brush at the edge of the paper. I always go back with a tissue and kind of wick that up before it has a chance to creep into your painting, because what it'll do is it'll create a really big, ugly bloom in your sky with all that excess water sitting on the edge of the paper, and it'll start leaching all that nice pigment in your sky back to the puddle of water along the edge of your painting. I've got a little, what do you call it, a puddle, and you always kind of want to be on the lookout for this. I got a big puddle right here. I'm just going to take a damp brush and wick it up so that it doesn't also create any blooms. I've got some skips in here. That doesn't matter. Just let it go. I can see I'm going to have a bloom here. If I take a drier brush and I have a great brush that I use all the time. Friend of mine, I watched a demo he did, and this goes back to last spring. And he has this really old sable brush. And I thought, well, and it occurred to me, I have one of those. I have tons of these because they wear out and they lose their tip and they just are junk brushes and they get relegated to the back drawer. And what they're great for is you can dampen them a little bit and use them to just wipe things up and just kind of move things around and create really nice washes. So I keep one of these brushes always handy. They're great tools to have, but if you start to see something occurring that you're a little concerned about, you can always kind of pick it up. Maybe it's a cloud you want to create. You can literally kind of pick up some of the value in a couple places if you want, and kind of soften or smooth things out. Um, if we're about ready to move on to the next step, what I want you to do or to think about is, if you've got, you're all muted, so if you've got a hair dryer, go ahead and kind of dry your sky a little bit, because this is it. And we're going to be flipping this painting around, and I don't want this damp paper with wet pigment on it to start running in the wrong direction. So I'm going to just sort of set this pigment up. It may not be totally dry, but it's not going to move anymore. And I'm using a heat gun instead of a hair dryer, so it doesn't make a lot of noise. But basically, the next step that we're going to do is to flip our painting over. So I'm going to take my painting and turn it upside down. And now I'm going to replicate. See how my sky is the darkest blue down here at the bottom of the page? I want my darkest blue to be up here at the top, which would actually be closest to the viewer. And then as it comes farther away from the bottom of the paper, it gets lighter and lighter. Now, because this is sort of a glassy, reflective surface of water, it's not going to have these hard marks of clouds and stuff. So I'm going to actually take a brush. I don't want to get this too damp, but I'm going to come in and just very lightly dampen some of this paper. And I'm going to come right in underneath. Actually, I'm going to take it right up to where the water line is underneath these wharf reflections, and right up underneath this triangular bit of land, and get everything that's water just sort of damp. And I recommend that you kind of look at your paper from an angle to see where you've missed getting it dampened, because you'll see the dry spots if you look at it from an angle. But if you're looking straight on, you won't be able to tell it, because you won't be able to see where you've have missed getting it damp. All right, so now the surface is wet, and we're going to take the same colors that we worked with. I'm going to even use the same brush. Where did I put that brush? Here it is. And I'll just get some of that same cobalt. And I'm just going to, this is should be a very smooth application, and it should kind of start rolling downhill very smoothly. Now, there's a little reflection in the beneath this building that we want to leave a light, a negative shape. I don't want to put any blue in there, because I'm going to come back in with yellow, but I'm just getting a little bit of dark at the top of this page here, which actually would be the bottom of the painting. And everybody knows that cobalt is a cool color, right? It's not a warm color. What's a warm blue? Ultramarine, right? So I'm going to come back in a moment and get my brush dipped into some of the ultramarine in my palette. And I'm going to come in and just get a little bit of ultramarine in the top edge of this painting here. And we're going to get a nice flow where the gravity is bringing this paint downhill towards the buildings. And I'm just going to wipe up any excess water like we did with the sky. And now, if I want to accelerate some of that movement, I can tip the board a little bit, and all of a sudden it's starting to move. Now, flip it back over and you can kind of see a little better what you've done. But I'm going to come back in and just kind of come right across here, almost like I've got a bit of current in there. We'll leave it at that. So go ahead and get that done, and see where this didn't quite get all the way up. I'm going to bring my brush up here and just kind of get some wet in there, and let that blue kind of come up into the reflection beneath the, and I go right up into the pilings and the wharf, so that it's just all kind of a cool color. When I say it's not cool, I'm just bringing a little bit of the blue up in there, letting it kind of run down into the reflection. And that's it. We'll let that dry. And I can actually take a rigger. Everybody have a rigger? Something with a real springy point, or, long extended bristle on it. Get it just slightly damp. And I might throw a little bit of droplets of clean water right into the water here down towards the bottom, the lower left corner of the painting. And it won't, the gravity will cover most of that up, but it'll just loosen it up a little bit, and we'll let that have a chance to kind of do its thing. But all of a sudden, we've got a lot of paint on this paper. We've covered up, but we've left a real strong negative shape for these two buildings. We've got some open area here for some shadows and a bridge and a wharf back in here. But the main thing we want to do at this point is get this painted, get all this paint on here, and then let it dry. Because once it's dry, then we can come back in and paint on top of this without disturbing this beautiful underpainting that we've accomplished. So the next thing I'm going to do is, while you're finishing up this painting, I'm just going to make sure that everything is dry up around my skyline, above my buildings, where that tree line is going to go. Because before, I just gave it a cursory swipe with the heat gun. Now I want to make sure my paper is actually dry. So when I paint on top of this, it doesn't pick up the blue or the yellow ochre. It just has it kind of sealed in and set in the fiber of the cotton. And I'll take a couple of swipes here with my heat gun in the foreground water, and we'll let that dry as well. Because I'll come back and put more water on this. We'll get our reflections in here. We'll do a lot of fun stuff. But this is the underpainting that we want to get set and dry so we can paint on top of this. One of the mistakes that a lot of painters make is they don't allow the paper, once you've done this initial wash, to completely dry. Working on 300-pound paper here. If you're on 140-pound, it soaks up water instantly. The 300-pound, the dampness stays pretty wet in the painting for a long time. And if you start introducing another color while the surface of the paper or the interior fibers of the cotton within the paper are still damp, and that another color goes on, it just creates mud. It's like taking all the paint that you've mixed in your palette and you introduce burnt sienna, and you just start mixing it all together, and all of a sudden you've got this neutral gray muddy result. And if you want to keep your colors brilliant and a little more dramatic, make sure that this underpainting is dry. I just touched this with the back of my fingers. It's still very wet or cool. And the minute you let other colors soak in while it's damp, that's what generates that muddy effect. So it's important to get it nice and dry. And by my doing this, it allows you time to finish getting it to this stage as well with your painting. And then you can watch while I do the next step, and I'll dry and then you paint. So we'll go back and forth like that and just do little trade-offs things so that you can keep up with me while you're painting or while I'm painting. But now it's time to think about our background color. I like to use, again, this might be a good color, a good brush to use. It's a nice mop brush, but I'm going to pick up, I'll come over here so you can kind of see what I'm doing. A combination of royal blue, which is a really dark, rich blue. Indrathine is also similar to that. I'm going to pick up a little bit of Viridian with that, and Hooker's green, or a kind of a cool green. And I've got a really nice, rich, dark green. I can actually pick up a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange, and that'll even darken it further. It's a nice kind of tree color, very dark. And it's important to get a full load of really dark paint in our brush. And that's why we use this mixing well, is to make sure that we've got it fully charged in our brush and not just a little bit on the tip. Because if it's just a little bit on the tip, you'll get started with your big wash and you'll run out of paint, and it's like running out of gas on the highway. You just can't get down the road. So you've got to make sure you've got plenty to complete what you're doing. Now, I'm not going to have my darkest darks all the way out at the edge. I want my darkest darks to be right in here. So I'm just going to kind of come in here, and I've got a telephone pole that I want to leave as a negative shape. So I'm just going to come on either side of that, and I'll kind of come create some nice jagged tree shapes in here. Flip my brush handle over and just kind of push some of that wet paint up out of the wetness with the back of my brush handle to create a strong kind of tree image. And I can come out and just use the tip of my brush now to create some tree shapes coming out of that. And a lot of times you can just use the back of your brush handle. I'm going to come around this little house that I've got sketched in here. So we see the peak of the house. We've got another one. We've got all these tree shapes that are just kind of random tree shapes. I'm going to drop some cool color into that and let it just kind of transition from warms to cools. We'll come back over the top of some of this and paint darker colors later. This is still just sort of the underpainting. I've got a building here. It's coming up against a telephone pole, and I'll just preserve that shape of the pole as a negative shape. Come back in and get a little bit more of the cool color to drop in along the skyline. Use the back of my handle, my brush handle, to just get some of these tree shapes, kind of just suggestive of trees, but without a lot of detail in them. And I can always use a rigger or a smaller mop brush to create some of these shapes in here. And again, I like to get a little bit of warm colors in here just to kind of give it a pop of color. And when I say warm, I'm using like an orange, transparent orange. Get in between these little buildings here to create a rooftop. And then while it's wet, I'll just drop in some of that cool greenish color. But now as I get down towards the wharf areas, I'm going to really warm this up and just start coming across with a warmer tone. And I'm not, at this point, I'm not worried too much about accuracy here. I just want to get a wash and a tonal quality going across here as a wash, because I can come back in with darks later and really pop this all together. But you can see I've now created a really nice soft background color. It's got warms in it. It's got some cools in it. I can come back in and fill in a few places. I can, put a few more in these. But main thing I want to do is get my darkest darks right down in here around this building so that our eye and our attention comes to the building. And back in here, I want this to be a little darker, and it's still pretty wet, so I can get away with a lot. Got some tree shapes in here. I'll just use the tip of this brush to create the suggestion of a forest back there. But everything is not quite as intensely, with a value contrast. It's a little softer as we get over here and as we get over to the left and to the right. I've got these buildings that are in here. And I'm going to get some tree shapes going on. I'll get a little bit of maybe some sap green in here and get a stronger tree that's coming down right over the front of this house. And then on the other side, we'll use like raw umber. Clean that and get a really nice mix of raw umber and just let it warm up so it's not as much of a value contrast. But then I'll take a damp brush and just feather this away down to the top of this bridge so it just gets a little bit less intense as we come down. So there's our background color that is highlighting our center of interest. And I had a little bit of dark here that was kind of, I'm just softening some of these edges while everything's still wet.
Randy, I had a a problem with the connection. Can you go over the colours that you used for the ready browns?
Sure. What I did is I used a little bit of royal blue, which is a like an inthrine blue. It's a very staining dark blue. I mixed that with a little bit of Viridian, or if you don't have Viridian, Hooker's green, anything like a cool green. And then I added a little bit of transparent orange to that. And you can see there's some warm tones within some of this background without it being too defined. And that's really kind of what sets it apart, going from cools to warms. Once this dries, I'll come back with some really darks and put a few little darks in here around this building. But because right now it looks dark, but it's going to dry quite a bit lighter, and I'm not too worried about that. But I can also, while we're doing this, I'm going to take this kind of junk brush that I told you about earlier, and I'm going to come back in and just kind of soften and break up some of that dark, and just using a damp brush, pick up a little bit of the intensity, and maybe some of it goes up into the sky, maybe some of it softens some of the tree line. It's almost like a little bit of a gust of wind is blowing either pollen or dust or something, but we just don't see a complete defined edge on those treetops. In a few places, they're just softened. And what this does is it relieves the tension of a hard edge, and it makes the background feel less important. Whereas our foreground, where our center of interest is going to be, that's going to be very crisp and very important. So we want that to be very defined. And by using this little brush, I can really kind of soften things up and make them less important. All right, that's takes me to where I want to get this to dry. And I think we're probably in pretty good shape. So I'll take my heat gun. I've got a couple of little spots of light here. These are some buildings that are back here that don't look like much now, but I'll put some different colors on those, a little bit different value, and all of a sudden they'll start to look like buildings. But
Randy,
yes,
the question for you: what colour should Louise use instead of royal blue?
um, if you've got like a phthalo blue, but add a lot of raw umber with that to tone it down. The key is it's a staining color. A phthalo blue is very intense, as is royal blue, and they're dark, they're staining, and they're going to maintain that dark. A lot of people have trouble getting a really dark, and ultramarine typically makes things darker, but we want this to lean more to the green side. So one other alternative might be using ultramarine and some sap green possibly, or a Viridian, just to give it more of a blue-green effect. But then you've got to also have some warmer pops of value contrast in there with either a transparent orange or a raw umber or a burnt sienna, something like that, just to give you some variation in those background colors. Now, this is still really, really wet, so I want to make sure I've got this dry before I start working on my buildings or the wharf or anything else in this painting. And I think what we'll do next is I'm going to address these buildings in the background and make them less important. They have to be just sort of contextual, something there that says there's other buildings on this island that are part of the Back Bay. It's not all just this one center of interest building. But I've got to get this dry before I continue on. So I'm going to give this an opportunity to kind of set in the paper before I go into these other shapes. Otherwise, things will start bleeding and getting kind of busy. But these are not real important. They're just there to kind of define and provide context. Now, I had a shadow side of this building, so I'm going to come in and just put a little bit of a shadow on this building, a bit of warmth on that. We'll put that on there. We've got a stairwell, and then we've got a darker thing underneath it here with some posts. And I don't always really worry too much about how perfect everything is, because if you can get value contrast in there, you'll be fine. This is the little bit of shadow underneath their balcony, and I'm just going to soften the underside of that so it feels like a shadow. I'll come back in with a little bit of dark. I'm going to use a quinacridone burnt orange and ultramarine to really get a nice crisp dark in here. And then underneath the overhang, there's a little bit of dark there. But then I'll take some cobalt and just soften that a little bit. And then a little bit of yellow ochre. So now we've got a shape that replicates a building. And there's a little bit of the shadow side of this building's a little darker. And I will do the same thing with this next one. We've got a dark side of the gable coming down this corner. And I'll just rinse my brush and take a clean brush and just kind of push it up towards that edge. I don't want to pull that dark away from the corner of the house, but I want the paint to get, gradually lighter as it goes back towards that far back corner of the house. And then while that's still wet, I'll bring the shadow underneath the rooftop. And now we've just created a house just with two little brush strokes there. Same with this guy. We're going to get a little bit of shadow on the dormer, and then coming down the side of the house, I want to get this a little bit darker right along the edge here, and let that just kind of fade away back into the trees. And then we've got just a little bit of shadow coming down the eave like that. And I'll put some windows in here later after everything's dried, but you can see while this is wet, I can drop in a little bit extra value and punch those up. And once we put the windows and things in there, we'll probably put a glaze over that and it'll just knock that back. But that takes care of those for the time being. And now I think what I'd like to do is clean my palette or create a little spot in my palette where I can mix up a really very light yellowy green color, a vermilion yellow, azo yellow, lemon yellow. It's a cool yellow, but it's too bright. So I'm going to add just a touch of cerulean to this. And we'll just get, you can see it's just kind of knocking the intensity of that yellow down. But it's a warm yellow, and I'm going to add just a tickle of yellow ochre. That's too much, so I'm just going to take a little bit of that and put it in with that yellow, just to make it less electric. You don't want it to be too electric. This is kind of a faded paint job on this building, and I'm going to paint both buildings the same color. I'll come in, put shadows in them. I'll put the shadow side of the buildings later, but right now, I just want to get all of this color on the building. I might have to add water to your brush to get it to flow. And it doesn't matter if it gets too faded, because that's the whole point of it, is we want to have a fairly light building. Now, while you still got that color in your palette, come back in and just drop in a little bit. This doesn't even have to be perfect. Just drop in a little bit of brush stroke beneath the wharf, very loose, with that same color. And that's your reflection down there. And I'm going to get just a touch more of the cerulean added into that in a couple spots, particularly as it gets closer to the reflection of the wharf. Now, while that's still, the building itself is still wet, up in the peak, I'm going to come in and drop in just a little bit of cerulean with a wet brush and let it just kind of flow down the corner, and do a little bit on this side as well. Maybe come down along the underside of this eave just a bit. But now we've got just a little bit of coolness on the shadow side of that building. We'll let that all dry. And that we'll let that dry with a heat gun, hair dryer, whatever you got, but just get it to set up. My brush. And you remember I said to take this kind of an old ratty brush, clean it really well, wipe all the water off, and you go back to the backside corner of this building and just kind of pick up a little bit of that of the color, and you can just push it away from that back corner, and it'll make that far back corner of both of these buildings a little lighter in value. All right, now one of the things we've got back here is these 3 tanks, and I think they're they're CO2 tanks or compressed air. I'm not sure what they use, maybe refrigeration for the fishing, when they bring the fish in. But if we take that same brush that I was using, that kind of raggedy brush, where did I put it? And it's just slightly damp, but it's clean. You might be able to just drag it across the trees and just drag some of that color on the shadow side of each of these tanks. Don't try to get too much color on there. You're just putting a little shadow and leaving the right side of the tanks crisp and white. But see how that, I don't know if you can see this. I'll see if I can get down here and zoom in a little bit. You can see how that softened the edge, and it pulled some of that value, that pigment from my trees right across the left side of those tanks, giving them just a little bit of dimension. Makes them feel like there's some size to them. In this case, they're cylindrical. And then you can always take a little bit of cerulean blue and just pop that into the far side or right up against the inside of that. So now we've created some depth. And if you look now, I think you can see what I'm trying to accomplish with that is just to create a little bit of dimension there. There. We'll let that dry. And while we're letting that do its thing, I'm going to come over to the bridge and get a very cool color. I'm going to use a little bit of cobalt blue and a little Payne's gray. And I've got kind of a really wet mixture of a kind of a stainless steel color. It's just, or a steel, it's aluminum, whatever you want to call it. But this is for my bridge siding. And I'm just going to come in here and create a nice wash across this bridge here. And it doesn't have to be perfect. We're just adding some tone to take it from a bright white down to a kind of a shadowed color. And we'll let that dry. So I'll take my heat gun and I'll make sure that gets dried. I'm going to pick up a little bit where I overpainted on the little sand dune there. Eliminate the brightness of the white paper. And once it's dry, I can come back in and put some little gaps between the rails on the siding. But I got to let that dry. And I'm going to move to a different part of the painting. We're at the point now where I want to probably think about my wharf. I want to get that started. So the best thing to use, if you've got a flat, try to find a flat that, I've got this flat, it's about a 3/4 inch flat. I'm going to get some nice warm color, and I'm just going to come down and not only just paint the vertical plane of the wharf, but go right down into the reflections in the water, because one is the same. I mean, the reflection is exactly the same as the wharf itself. It's got a little bit of warmth to it, but it's also pretty wet. And it's got a little bit of the cobalt blue in there. And I'm just going to kind of be true to the top of that wharf and make sure I maintain a fairly straight edge across there. And then just bring that down towards the water line, clean my brush, add just a touch of ultramarine to that, and bring this right on down into my reflection. So now I've got this going. I'm going to go back to that kind of smaller brush. Let's see what I should use here. I'm going to use a round brush. It's a synthetic brush. It has a nice point to it. And I'm just going to soften these edges, and I'm going to lift a little bit of the where the pilings are, just to relieve some of that dark. So I'm just going to come along and create with a clean brush, using the tip of my brush, and just pick up that damp paint. It's not flowing paint, it's just damp. But I'm picking up just a highlight where these pilings are. And then I'm going to continue down, go in the opposite direction, because the angle on the pilings are going to be angled in the opposite direction within our reflections, but they're also going to be light. So we've got to pick up some of that paint. And a lot of this I can come back in with darker colors in between. Now, why didn't I come around the other side? I want to have warmer paint over there, or warmer pigment. So I'm going to use a combination of burnt sienna, maybe a little bit of transparent orange, and I'm going to come in and create the same effect going back this way, but it's warmer. And I'm going to come right down into the water where my reflections are. And now I'll pick up a little bit of ultramarine, mix it in with that. And at the water line, I'm going to kind of bring that down. And then over on the other side, I'm going to just create a little bit of dark right along that water line. Go back to my round and just kind of pull that down in. Well, I got to get a little more pigment on my brush. And you can see I'm just being true to the water line. I'm coming back on the other side, sort of a suggestion of where that water line is. Clean my brush, and then just tickle that dark and bring it on down to the bottom of the reflections. So we don't really see where everything ends. It just has a variety of darkness. I'm going to pick up a little bit of a warm color like quinacridone burnt orange and mix that with the junk in my palette and just introduce some of this dark that's got a little bit of a warm cast into the reflection. And coming down the backside of each one of the piling reflections. So we get the effect of some darker and some vertical looks or brush strokes in those reflections. Now, I've got just out on the ends of these pilings in the reflection, I'm just going to use a little tip of my brush to suggest where some of these piling tips are. They don't have to be perfect, but just breaks that up a little bit. And then I'm going to go up into the top of these pilings and make the top of them where they're up against a lighter background a little darker. So we start to see something sticking up past all that dark from our pilings. So now we've created, let me see if I can enlarge this for you. You see how we've kind of handled that? I'm going to loosen it up a little bit with some of the junk in my palette and just create some horizontal movement across some of this area here. Get it a little darker, particularly right out here on the corner. And I'm just picking up some cool colors, some warm colors, not worrying too much about how accurate it is, just getting a variety of colors within that wash along that vertical surface. Clean my brush and just pull some of that down into the vertical plane of that wharf. But by keeping it wet, it keeps it loose. And I can take that same ultramarine and a little bit of the quinacridone burnt orange and drop that in a couple places right into the water line. So we don't know exactly where it is, but we just have a stronger feeling along the water line that there's a little definition there. All right, so that takes care of that. Now we've got the pilings on the right side, or the warm side. I'm going to get a little burnt sienna, add a little bit of ultramarine to that, and come back in with just the shadow behind each one of these pilings. And it's just a suggestion. It's not perfect, but it just kind of, and don't make your pilings exactly the same spacing apart. That some of them are close, some of them are farther apart, but it just it breaks everything up a little bit, and that takes care of that. I'm going to come back in and make this corner just a little bit darker, so we really have a strong contrast where we turn that corner. All right. While we're waiting for that to kind of dry, I'm going to go back against the land. They built a retaining wall out of the same material that they use for their wharfs. It's got to be a little bit darker and a little bit cooler. So using quinacridone burnt orange or burnt sienna and a little bit of ultramarine, I can come back in and create a really nice kind of cool color. And the sand kind of creates the definition of where this retaining area is. And I'll pick up a little bit more of the warm color, stick that in here at the base where it's just up against the beach. And then I'll put the pilings in a moment, but for now, we'll let that dry because I'm going to get some shadows going on with that. I'm actually going to get a little bit of yellow ochre, raw sienna, but keep it really light, kind of light in value. And this is the beach or the sand at the base of this retaining wall before you get into the water. And that's right at the water line. There's your water line coming across. And we've got to get a reflection beneath that that's going to be a little bit darker still. So I'm going to get more ultramarine, more yellow, quinacridone burnt orange, but drier, much drier. So I can get a little bit darker down in here. And I'm not going all the way to the bottom of the reflection because I'm going to take my brush and clean it. And I'm just going to kind of pull this down as a soft edge into the water. And now with a little bit of ultramarine, I can kind of come in and define where that water line is. It goes back in underneath this bridge. This is all going to be in shadow in a moment, but we'll let this dry. And while we're waiting for that to dry, I'm going to completely clean my brush. And I want to take some fairly dry cobalt blue, really intense. And I'm going to just create some shapes back here. They don't have to be perfectly defined, but these are industrial containers, whatever they might be. I'm going to take some cobalt teal light, which is a real strong teal color. Maybe do another bit of those back in here. And then I'm going to get a little bit of orange, really bright orange. And I'll stick some of that right in there. And then I'll get a little bit of pyro red, cadmium red, whatever. It's a warm red, but it has to be fairly dry. And I'm going to just drop a little bit of this in a few spots here. And then go back to my cobalt. I'll rinse that off my brush and get that same cobalt and drop a little bit of that back in here as some darks. And what I've now created is a whole bunch of interesting things that might be going on, but they're so far in the background, we don't really know what they are. Our eye just reads them as industrial product that's part of the painting that's important. And so there's your stuff that kind of takes precedence about what's going on with this building. I used a little bit of that cobalt teal, a little bit of the azo yellow and cobalt. And now that my building is dry, I'm going to come right down along the edge of this building and come up the peak and just now clean my brush and just feather that color back. So it's lighter over here, but I've got a little bit stronger shadow right up against this corner, and then right underneath the overhang. Just very quick little brush stroke, take right along there. I'm going to do the same thing with this part of this building. Come right down that corner, clean my brush, and then just feather that back. So just this one corner and up along the roof peak has a little bit of shadow to it. And once that dries, this building will be casting a shadow across this adjacent building. And I'll put that in there, and that will further help me define the shape of this building. But that pretty much helps define that. Now, while we're waiting for that to dry, let's talk about our bridge. We did a nice job with this retaining wall, and then we go into this big white shape here, which we've got to address. So I'm going to go back now and pick up some of the same color that I had mixed in my palette, which was right here. It's a little bit of ultramarine, a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange. It gives it a warm, dark, earthy color. And while I've got that on this brush that has a nice point to it, I'm going to put my pilings in here. And they're just quick little marks that come down. And as I get back in this corner here, I can bring some of those darks right up in a few spots. And then also right up in this corner, now that this is dry, I can use this little bit darker value here. Maybe I've got a ladder that's coming down and a couple of things here in the water. But clean my brush and just soften those darks so that they become a little stronger, more defined part of that wharf, leaving this brighter. You can definitely see a light side and a cool side. The same with this retaining wall. I want to get the upper part of this where it's against the parking lot a little bit darker so we have more value contrast. And then clean my brush and tickle the underside of that so that it just kind of filters down away from the top of that into more of a warmer retaining wall effect. Add a little bit of that blue to it as we get closer to the bridge. And then it's going to create a little bit of a shadow that kind of comes down like this across the deal and goes underneath the bridge. And I've got some supports that are holding that bridge up. I'm going to just paint around those and create a nice little dark. I'm going to get increasingly dark here with some Payne's Gray with my ultramarine. Drop that into this wet area. And then get maybe a little bit warmer with some quinacridone burnt orange in that same mixture and bring it right down across the water. Go back and get some more cool, maybe even some Payne's Gray. And come right across, casting a shadow across these pilings. But now all that warm that I put in there is bleeding up into that shadow area. So it gives a nice soft kind of effect. And then the peaks or the tips of these little pilings are showing through the shadows and reflections in the water. And we still have a fairly strong water line. And I can take maybe a little bit of alizarin crimson and put some little, mix it with some of this dark. And so I've got sort of a neutral, but I've got some little indications of the gaps in the bridge railings. Don't make them all exactly the same, just kind of give us a little indication. And then we'll put a wash across those after that dries. So it's coming together. Now, while we're letting that dry, let's address this big pile of mud and sand, whatever it is. Let's take a big brush let's say this round here that's got a kind of a ragged edge on it. And let's get a little bit of ultramarine, mix that with a little bit of burnt sienna, and just bring some of that down. It's kind of a gray color, but over the yellow ochre, it'll look like a clay color. And we might bring a little bit of the green color in. We'll just kind of vary this a little, keep it loose. A little bit more of the raw umber in some areas that are wet. So we have a little more intense warmth down along the water line and maybe a little bit up in here, so that it feels like there's some movement across that shape of the building without having to do a lot of detail. The more detail you put over here, the more it'll pull your eye away from our center of interest. So we want it wet. We want to have some warms in there. We want to have some cools, but we just don't want to draw too much attention to it. I'll come back in and darken our shadows that tuck back in behind this hill, after that dries. But now that we've got that done, we want to go to the other side of the painting and make a continuation of a wharf type structure that goes beyond and off the page to the left. So I'm going to get a little bit of dark. We'll mix with ultramarine, and we'll mix that with some quinacridone burnt orange, just to get a nice dark. And I'm going to just kind of come back in and create a little dark back in here behind this, up to this building, along the edge of this. I'm just going to kind of create a shape that's dark. And that dark is pushed up against this building, and it comes down into the water. And I'm just going to make this fairly wet so it has a blurred edge. We don't really see where the water ends and the wharf begins. It's just wet. And then I'm going to pick up a little bit of the ultramarine, and I'm mixing it with just a touch of the burnt sienna that we had in our palette. And I want to bring that right down around the edge of my wharf reflection. So we'll get this nice and dark. And I just put it's slightly damp. So now when you drop some stronger pigment in there, it just creates a nice edge defining where the water is underneath this pilings and up against the reflection that's coming off of the wharf there. There. This is, I'm going to come over to the other side now and just get darker right up inside and underneath this bridge. And if the edge kind of bleeds a little bit, that's okay. I have a soft edge there because it's wet. And I'm just going to come across and lay a very subtle wash across this bridge. We'll let that dry. I'm leaving a couple of ticks of white where the bridge supports are catching some light. I've got some bleed over from the shadow onto this hill, but that's fine. That doesn't bother me. What I need to do now is add just a little bit of raw umber and a little bit of orange. You could also use a little bit of burnt sienna, this building, and break it up a little bit. So you've got some places that are a little more intense and others that are a little more subtle. And then it just helps add a little definition down into the reflections in the water. And I'm just going to take a little bit of that same color and just very soft and subtly add some warmth up into the peak of this building on the shadow side. Let's see, I want to also take and put a little definition now beneath this balcony. It sort of helps And I'll put some doors and some windows and things that are just suggestions in here in these buildings. Add a little bit of dark right in here for a door. And I'll put a wash over those after that dries. And then over on this far left side of the building, I'm just going to put a few little gaps in between and keep it pretty loose, just suggesting that there's some fencing or something going on there. And then we talked about putting the pilings in down into the water. I'm going to actually put some darks. We don't know exactly where they end and where the reflections start. It doesn't matter. It just, we've got some little vertical rhythm going on over there. We'll punch this up a little bit over on this side as well, just to create some darker darks. That helps. And now it's the last thing we're going to do is work on our water reflections. And we've also got, let's think about the best brush to use for some of the reflections that are going to go in the water. I've got this little Escoda Perla brush. A lot of people are using these now. They're synthetic, they're fairly inexpensive, and they keep a really nice point. They hold plenty of water, but more importantly, you can get some really fine strokes with this. So I'm going to pick up some really decent darks. And I've got a telephone pole here. I've got a telephone, actually a mast that goes in front of this building. There's a telephone pole there. And I want to just kind of very lightly put something in the water that suggests that these are little, reflections that are coming down into the foreground. I've got a little bit of a mast over there. I'm going to have some trees in here as well. And I want to just push some darks up against the side of this building. Pretty subtle, just to define where the edge of that building ends. And then maybe rinse my brush and soften any brush stroke so it just becomes a very cool wash over the top of some of this material that's above the wharf. Okay, let's address the next big feature in this painting. We've got a let me see if I can make this a little bigger. We got a tree here, kind of a high point. We got trees there. I would like to get some more trees right in here to justify having a stronger reflection in the water. So I'm going to try to pick up a little bit of sap green and a little bit of royal blue. And these are not going to be quite as dark as the tree that's already there, but just some shape that provides a little bit more elevation. That works, and it isn't quite as repetitive as these two. I want to avoid having that repetition, so I'm going to just create some fill in there. And then I want this tree to be a little stronger in the foreground. So I'm going to pick up some ultramarine, maybe some royal blue, a little bit of orange. And I'm going to come back in and just create, get more of a sap green going. Push this up in there. Clean my brush. Now I've got a fairly strong tree shape that's going to call for reflections in the water. We've got some over here as well. So what we want to do is just take a big brush. This is a big flat brush that I've got, and I'm just going to come down in my water, make some vertical strokes with clean water, and just in the area to the right of this building, just get some wet on my water. And the fact that my foreground blue that's for the reflective water surface is already dry, I can get away with this without picking anything up. And then I'm just going to take a kind of a nice big mop brush, and I want to get some Hooker's green, a little Viridian, a little bit of cobalt blue, maybe whatever dark I've got. And I just want to get some nice wet shapes in here. These are not defining the tree so much as just blocking in and creating some tone in my water. Come in right. I'm leaving a little gap between the land and the water line, and that's dry. So I'm able to come in with a little bit more of a dark in there. I'm going to let that dry. While that's happening, I'm going to take my wet brush and just get a little bit of burnt sienna and just kind of come across here with a little bit of warmth. Take my squirt gun if I don't like that, and I'll just give it a little squirt and let it run downhill and soften. It's like a little bit of land that got, or mud flat, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to add some raw umber to that just to cool it off. And then maybe a little bit of quinacridone burnt orange and a little bit of ultramarine. But then I'll use the little squirt bottle, the misting bottle, and just soften that a little bit. So it just kind of runs down, and I can even pick up my board and kind of let that roll around a little bit till it dries. So we'll let this kind of soften, and I'm going to dry it. But before it gets completely dry, I want to take my Perla brush, the little round with a point on it, and probably put in some really nice dark raw umber, royal blue, that really nice rich dark, maybe a little orange in there. But if you look at my mixing palette, it's pretty dry. It's got a little bit of water to it, but it needs to have a little bit more of a dryness to it. And I'm going to come back in on top of these reflections and just put some real subtle little reflections in the water. You can kind of see what I'm up to here. And once this completely dries, I'll come back in and put a few dry marks on there. But for now, we'll let that dry. Once again, I'm going to wick up all the excess water that's collecting around the edge of my painting so it doesn't creep back up into that nice soft reflected area. And we got to let it dry. So while you're doing all your painting, I'm just going to dry. And I'm going to put in my telephone poles, and we'll work on those in a moment. But this is got some nice darker, softer value over here in this lower right foreground. There's some light areas that the sky is reflecting through, the tree reflections. But the main thing is I'm trying to get this nice and dry so I can come in and put a few little tickles of darker reflection in just a couple of spots. Doesn't take much. So it's still not dry enough, but we'll go somewhere else until that dries. If you need to, if it's too cool, you might need to, rinse and start over. Don't keep pushing it, but get it so you've got a little bit of warmth, but it's a true dark. And I'm going to come back in and put the top of my telephone pole in here. And you can see some of this coming through where it's up against the sky. And you see all this dark in there. This is up here. And then we had a little bit of a thing going past that. And then we've got this mask that's right coming down across the face of this thing. I'm going to get that in there. And I want to get a little bit of light above that. So we can try just lifting, but I have a feeling I'm going to have to take like a magic eraser or an X-Acto knife and tickle that with a little bit of white. But you can start off by seeing if you can just lift a little bit of white from that dark background, going up into, where the pole is against a dark background, it looks light, and where it's against a light background, it becomes very dark. I'm going to come back in and darken the bottom of this so we have some variation. And then we've got this little pole that comes across, and then we've got a bit of a reflection, or I'm sorry, a shadow going across there. And I want to get this a little darker down in here. There we go. So we got some things happening in there. We've got maybe a window or something, and that's a little darker. And then this bridge over here, I'm going to get a little bit of ultramarine, just mix it up with some of the neutral stuff that's wet in my palette, and just kind of create a little bit of a shadowing coming across some of these areas here. And this is still very wet, so I'm going to go back in and dry so I can come in and finish my reflections. And while we're waiting for that, I'm going to get some warm orange. It's a transparent orange. And I'm going to put some boxes or something right here on the edge of this wharf, so it feels like there's some activity going on in there. Maybe some royal blue, something in there, and clean my brush and just kind of soften that a little bit and get some really dark in there to get some shadows. I think that works. Now this is pretty dry. So I'm going to get a little bit of sap green, a little bit of viridian, a little bit of the royal blue, just whatever I've got here in my palette that's kind of a dark blue-green. And I want to get some of these reflections to just kind of come. I'm going to soften some of these in a few spots and get a little harder line in a few others. Over here, we've got more stuff happening. And then the last thing I want to do is maybe take a big brush, big flat, and get a little bit of ultramarine, sort of a wash, not too dark, more of a glaze. And maybe kind of come across here with some current that's coming across the foreground. And there you've got a pretty good rendition of a very loose painting of what's going on. And I'm adding just some of that same wash that I just used there. I'm actually putting between some of these buildings to create shadows and also to cool down so it's not so important over here. And it brightens this up by cooling down this far side of the painting. All of a sudden what I'm doing is actually making my center of interest the most important part of the painting. I can come back in and cool off some of this background a little bit as well. And it just helps make all these other little chatter marks less important. And it really pops up this warehouse building that's on the wharf. So the other thing that I see that I need to adjust is I'm going to take some of this same wash and just kind of pull some of that into the shadow side of this building, but keep it pretty loose. So now we really feel like it's not really defining too much. It's very vague in the water. But I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's kind of where we want to be. And we can always I'm going to take my rigger, wherever it is. Here it is. And I want to, let's see, take a towel and cover my painting in a couple of spots. And just in this area where there's this little sandbar, get some darks and just kind of splatter a little bit on there just to indicate that there's some things in the foreground. And that way it didn't go everywhere. And now that we've got this, I'm going to make sure the water is dry. And we can sign the painting down in this quieter area, which gives a nice balance to everything we're trying to accomplish. So I'm going to use the same color, but a darker value of the water for my signature. So I'll take just some of this blue-green and use that. And there we go. Now, if I wanted to, I could take a, thought I had an X-Acto knife here somewhere. Where did I put that? I've lost it. If you had an X-Acto knife, you can scrape out a little bit of white chatter on those telephone poles in a couple spots, or you can use a little bit of white gouache. Looking for something to put this in. I'm going to use this part of my lid up here to take a little bit of that same calligraphy brush, mix up a little bit of the white gouache, and on my telephone poles, got too big a chunk on there. I got to make sure that I've got just enough to get some white in here. Doesn't take too much, but it just that vertical rhythm we were talking about, just having some of those white verticals breaking up the horizontal bands that go across your painting help create that rhythm that you're looking for. But that's pretty much it. And we can always come back in and clean our brush, add a little bit of the darks. And then I also want to get a little darker underneath that bridge with some stronger darks. Now that this is drying, come back in here and really punch up that dark. So we feel like there's some depth there. We're not sure what it is, but it has a little bit of mystery, and it goes back up the creek because all that drainage is going back out into the back bay. And that works. We got a little bit of a shoreline in there. Might have a little bit over in here somewhere. I'm just punching up my water line so that there's just a little bit of definition in a couple spots where we see this more, and a little bit of the shadows or the reflections in the water that would mimic where the pilings are vertical. Doesn't need much, just enough. And I think that would probably be our painting. It has a nice loose feel to it, and yet it captures the feeling you get of seeing this particular location.